In the quiet, affluent suburbs of California during the 1970s and 1980s, a shadow moved through the night with terrifying impunity. The perpetrator, eventually known as the Golden State Killer, orchestrated a campaign of burglaries, sexual assaults, and murders that paralyzed entire communities. Law enforcement agencies collected mounting physical evidence, preserving biological samples in the hope that future technology might one day illuminate the face of an invisible predator. For decades, those biological samples sat in climate-controlled evidence lockers, representing a profound investigative paradox. The DNA profile was pristine, a definitive genetic fingerprint of the killer, yet it was entirely useless without a comparative match. Investigators routinely ran the sequence through CODIS, the national DNA database maintained by the FBI, but the system only contained profiles of known offenders. The perpetrator had never been flagged, leaving the trail absolutely cold. The traditional boundaries of forensic science had reached their absolute limit. Detectives were trapped in a frustrating loop, possessing the biological blueprint of a serial killer but lacking the key to decode his identity. The case files gathered dust, transitioning from active investigations into historical archives. How could law enforcement bypass the limitations of criminal databases to identify a suspect who had meticulously avoided the justice system for 40 years? The answer emerged not from a police precinct, but from the booming industry of direct-to-consumer ancestry testing. Millions of individuals were voluntarily mapping their heritage, mailing saliva swabs to private companies to uncover their ethnic origins and locate distant relatives. This vast crowdsourced genomic library represented an untapped reservoir of biological data. Investigators hypothesized that if the killer's DNA was uploaded to these networks, his relatives might unwittingly expose him. To execute this unprecedented strategy, investigators turned to GEDmatch, an open-source public genealogy database where users pooled their raw genetic data. Unlike closed commercial platforms, GEDmatch allowed anyone to upload a DNA file to search for familial connections. Forensic experts took the crime scene DNA, translated it into a compatible digital format, and initiated a search. They were no longer looking for a direct match. They were hunting for family ties. The initial search returned distant genetic echoes, identifying individuals who shared fractions of a percent of DNA with the unidentified suspect. These were third and fourth cousins, people who shared common ancestors from the early 19th century. A specialized team of genetic genealogists began the grueling process of reverse engineering a family tree. They combed through census records, birth certificates, obituaries, and marriage licenses, meticulously connecting branches across generations to isolate a specific lineage. Building this sprawling genetic network was a staggering logistical challenge, requiring investigators to trace thousands of individuals across multiple states and decades. The family tree expanded exponentially, encompassing people who had absolutely no connection to the crimes. As the genealogists narrowed the branches down to a single family line in California, a critical question remained. Which of these male relatives was the phantom who had terrorized the state? To pinpoint the suspect, the investigative team applied traditional detective work to the genetic framework. They filtered the remaining names through the established parameters of the Golden State Killer profile. They looked for a male of a specific age, with blue eyes, who lived or worked near the crime scenes during the specific windows of the attacks. One by one, potential relatives were eliminated based on geography, age, or verifiable alibis. The cross-referencing process ultimately isolated a single, highly compelling target. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo. He was a former police officer who had operated in the exact jurisdictions where the early crimes occurred, possessing the tactical knowledge and geographic familiarity that investigators had long suspected. DeAngelo had lived a quiet, unassuming life in the Sacramento suburbs for decades, hiding in plain sight while the world searched for a monster. Identifying DeAngelo through genetic genealogy was only the first step. Investigators needed absolute forensic confirmation before making a move. Law enforcement initiated covert surveillance on his residence, waiting for an opportunity to collect a discarded item containing his DNA. They covertly recovered a tissue from his trash and swabbed the door handle of his vehicle. The chain of custody was meticulously documented as these surreptitious samples were rushed to the crime lab for comparative analysis. The laboratory results were definitive, confirming a direct, undeniable match between DeAngelo's discarded DNA and the biological evidence preserved from the historic crime scenes. The genetic puzzle had finally been solved, bridging a 40-year gap in a matter of months. But as tactical teams prepared to descend on his suburban home, a new legal frontier loomed. Would the courts accept an identification born from an open-source genealogy website? In April 2018, law enforcement officers surrounded DeAngelo's home and took him into custody without incident. The 2018 arrest sent shockwaves through the global law enforcement community and the public at large. The Phantom had been reduced to a frail, elderly man standing in a courtroom holding cell, yet the revolutionary method used to capture him immediately sparked intense legal scrutiny regarding privacy rights and the boundaries of digital search and seizure. Defense attorneys and civil liberties advocates rapidly mobilized, questioning the constitutionality of forensic genealogy. They argued that uploading a suspect's DNA to a public database constituted an unreasonable search under the Fourth Amendment, effectively weaponizing the genetic data of innocent relatives. The legal debate centered on whether individuals who submitted their DNA to consumer platforms had legally consented to law enforcement sweeping those databases for criminal investigations. Prosecutors countered that the investigative technique was entirely lawful, emphasizing that GEDmatch was a public forum with open terms of service. They maintained that investigators had utilized the platform exactly as any private citizen would, simply searching for familial connections. Furthermore, the actual arrest was based on the abandoned DNA DeAngelo left in public, which legally carries no expectation of privacy. The genealogy search merely provided the tip that directed the surveillance. The anticipated courtroom showdown over the admissibility of genetic genealogy was ultimately preempted. Faced with an insurmountable mountain of conventional DNA evidence and the prospect of capital punishment, DeAngelo agreed to a sweeping plea deal. He entered multiple guilty pleas, officially closing the books on a reign of terror that had haunted California for generations. While the plea avoided a binding appellate ruling on the genealogy technique, the method's efficacy was undeniable. The resolution of the Golden State Killer case fundamentally altered the landscape of criminal justice. It proved that time and anonymity were no longer absolute shields for violent offenders. Almost overnight, forensic genealogy changed cold case investigations across the globe. Police departments established specialized genetic units, dusting off decades-old evidence files and submitting degraded samples to specialized laboratories, hoping to replicate the astonishing success of the DeAngelo investigation. In the years following the 2018 breakthrough, hundreds of dormant cases have been successfully resolved using this exact methodology. Unidentified human remains, long known only as John or Jane Does, have been given their names back. Serial rapists and murderers who believed they had permanently escaped justice have found detectives knocking on their doors. The technique bypasses the traditional reliance on prior criminal records, turning every distant cousin into a potential witness. Despite its undeniable success, the practice remains highly regulated and deeply controversial. Major consumer DNA companies have updated their privacy policies, requiring users to explicitly opt in before their genetic profiles can be accessed by law enforcement. The Department of Justice has issued strict interim guidelines mandating that forensic genealogy only be used for violent crimes or identifying human remains, and only after all traditional investigative leads have been thoroughly and demonstrably exhausted. The era of the truly cold case is rapidly coming to an end. The intersection of ancestral curiosity and forensic science has created an inescapable web of biological truth, fundamentally shifting the balance of power between investigators and those who operate in the shadows. The genetic code left behind at a crime scene is no longer a silent witness. It is a map leading inevitably back to the perpetrator, generation by generation.